Do you believe in democracy? You know what I've heard people saying? That democracy is dead. I've also heard it in conversations this August at the Alpbach Forum in Tyrol. Being engaged with one of the most dynamic festival of ideas in Europe, I naturally get a chance to talk to students from all over Europe and the world. I remember two conversations in particular. One night standing outside Gasthof Jakoba, opposite the church and the graveyard where Erwin Schrödinger is buried, not his cat, the quantum physics Nobel Prize. Beer in hand, students swarming out from late night lectures and art seminars. I was talking to Adam, a chemistry student from Frankfurt. And he was arguing that democracy was dead because corporate interests had taken over. Look at the diesel scandal the massive car industry got away with. No ordinary business would have been let off the hook for such a crime. Or see the financial crisis. Banks were rescued, but the poorest were the losers. Corporate interests have taken over, he said, and our political elites don't care for democracy. I could see he had somewhat of a point. A couple of days later, I was hiking up, or as the Tyrolese would say, walking, because it was a light walk. I was hiking up to a mountain cabin with a couple of students, and Julia, a law student from London, was arguing that democracy is dead because ordinary people couldn't be trusted with complexity. She said, look at Trump, look at Brexit. People have no clue, and populists will always exploit that. But she argued that we should look at Singapore. They had found a way with managed democracy where the best deliver the best outcomes. She'd seen another way. What would you have argued in these situations? What would have been your points standing at Jakoba late night or hiking up that mountain? Well, you know what I said and what I say today? Democracy is not dead. It's still alive, and we can bring it back from the brink. We can if we allow citizens, that is all of us, to get engaged in decision-making and lawmaking in a much deeper way than just going to vote. What I'm going to tell you about are no fantasies, but tried and tested ways of online and offline participatory democracy. Do you know Café Bräunerhof in Vienna? It's one of my favorite cafes. Nice newspaper selection, grumpy waiters, okay coffee, lots of history. A year ago, I was sitting with Axelle Lemaire. Axelle, a French woman trained as a lawyer, and a couple of years ago joined the French Parliament as a political outsider. In a surprise move, Axelle was named the first ever Minister for Digital Affairs in France in 2015. Axelle was soon after charged with creating the first ever big digital reform bill or republic, a bill for the digital republic governing all digital regulation. But she decided to do it a different way because she had a firm belief that citizens, all of us, could be involved in lawmaking. You know, we all use Wikipedia every day, a product of crowd intelligence. But somehow we haven't gotten around to using that in the process of lawmaking. Axelle wanted to change that. Her prime minister was skeptical and said, look, if this fails, you're on the line and have to resign. She didn't get a budget, so she took 30,000 euros out of her travel budget to fund the online platform to harvest ideas to write this law. Just to give you an example of what that meant. Esports is massive in France. And the esports community had no proper regulation, no law governing their industry. They were in a gray zone next to illegality. When that online process opened, asking citizens to get involved in writing a digital bill, they brought forward suggestions and got out and made very sensible suggestions of how to regulate the industry. Now France has one of the most modern esports laws in the world. Can you imagine a more apolitical community than gamers? And yet they got involved. The one thing, however, they haven't quite figured out yet is to sort of co-write laws with your joystick. I'm sure we'll be there in 10 years' time when we see each other next. But you know what? This is good for harvesting the crowd intelligence. But what about ideological questions that create big divisions, where online processes seem to even fire up more discourse and more division? Is there a way to create a common ground on issues that are currently separating Europe? Issues like gay marriage, immigration, or, as for Britain, Brexit? Well, I tell you, there is a way. Ordinary citizens, any one of you could be among them, chosen by the lot, by random, coming together in an assembly and in a protected, safe environment, talking and debating and putting forward sensible recommendations. Sounds weird to you? Well, it's been tried and tested. In fact, it's been so successful that it's been running for a couple of years in the Republic of Ireland, and it's called a citizen assembly. A year ago, I traveled to Dublin to meet one of the masterminds behind the citizen assembly, David Farrell. David is a political scientist by training. I met him on a late November night in a Dublin pub, drinking a couple of pints of Guinness. I hadn't eaten, so Guinness always comes in handy as a second meal. And David was telling me that the financial crisis in 2008 was his big wake-up moment. He decided that there needed to be a way where the gulf between citizenry and politicians should be made smaller. He convinced and lobbied with collaborators that in 2012, government implemented the first ever nationwide citizen assembly. It was so successful that in 2016, yet another 99 citizens from all over Ireland were selected by random, representative of the population, and they gathered to discuss, debate, and put forward recommendations on very central policy issues, issues of constitutional reform, as well as some very tough questions I'm going to tell you about. Just to know what that was like. One issue they debated was how Ireland could become a leader in tackling climate change and not lag behind as it does now. Over a weekend, citizens would hear independent expert advice, then later sit in small group discussions among themselves with facilitators that made sure that every single voice was heard. There was an independent chairwoman that watched over that there was no outside influence, and in the end, on Sunday evening, they voted on recommendations that had been pulled up together out of the sort of crowd intelligence. Some of their recommendations they then made to Parliament and government went far beyond what politicians had thought citizens would go for. Heavy CO2 taxes, immediately closing power stations that were burning peat and were not being effective and hurting the climate, and heavy investment in public transport. But the hardest question these people had to deal with was whether to legalize abortion in Ireland or not. This question had been dividing the country for more than 30 years. And here they were, over 5 weekends, debating and talking about an issue that they themselves had very differing opinions about that. In the end, they recommended the government to lift the ban on abortion that was written into the Constitution and to hold a referendum on this issue. The government felt forced to act, and on May 26 this year, 2018, 66% of the Irish population voted in favor of lifting the ban on abortion. You know, I think a way to bring democracy back from the brink is simple, allowing all of us to get involved, allowing us to be a voice that is heard in policymaking and lawmaking, transforming what it is to be a citizen. The digital age gives us the chance to rethink the way governments and citizens interact, how services are provided, and how our privacy is protected. I want all lawmaking processes all over Europe to be open for online consultation before they go into parliaments and before they're considered there and finally sort of crafted by specialists. I want citizen assemblies on a regional level, at nations, and advising the European Parliament. And I want them to have a power of veto when interests of future generations, of your children, of my children, are put at stake by narrow political interests, just focusing on the next election. I want these citizen assemblies to tackle the big questions. How are we going to deal with the climate crisis? How are we going to manage digitalization so that it benefits all of us and not just a few? What society do we want to live in? I think we all can be trusted with these questions. But before I end, let me tell you two even simpler ways of what we can almost do tomorrow to bring democracy back from the brink. Let's go vote, especially at the next upcoming European elections, and preferably for people who put citizen participation at the core of their manifestos. And even importantly, let's go to the pub and talk to somebody we disagree with, trying to find common ground, leaving our filter bubble. So let's vote and let's talk. Thank you.